Welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to have you here at the Center of AI in Society seminar series. And today we have an invited speaker that I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you, Professor Meredith Gore, with whom I have the pleasure to collaborate on several projects. Meredith is an amazing scientist who works at the intersection between criminology and conservation, and has had tremendous work with people on the ground, making impact on understanding how wildlife trafficking works, and how convergent science, which brings domain expertise from different interdisciplinary fields, from criminology, from ecology, from computer science, can work together in order to improve our knowledge of this domain. So Professor Gore received her PhD in Natural Resource Policy and Management from Cornell, and a master's in Environment and Resource Policy from George Washington University. She also is a National Academies of Sciences Jefferson Sciences Fellow and U.S. Department of State Embassy Science Fellow. Meredith is faculty right now at the University of Maryland, just moved from Michigan State. So congratulations, Meredith, on the new job. And we are really looking forward to hear from you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Delkina. It's a real thrill to be able to be part of the seminar series. And I just want to say thank you so much to you and everybody at the Center for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here today. And I see a whole host of attendees, and I look forward to a rich discussion here. Just want to caveat that I'm at home with a 5-year-old, and so I hope nothing is interrupted, but this is how we operate now in this world. So I will do my best to stay focused. But what I'm hoping is that, you know, I provoke some thinking, some discussions, and I think there is so much that we can all do together as scientists to really support society. So what I'm going to talk about today, I think I have to go over here and I need to share my screen. I think I need to have my screen sharing enabled. Potentially, I don't know who the host is. There
Hi.
we go.
Okay.
I got it. Thank you. So I'm going to run through a PowerPoint, and I would love for you all to ask questions. So you know, let's make this interactive. We all have enough talking heads on virtual screens these days. So I can see the Q&A, and certainly there's time at the end. But what I would like to talk about is something that's really near and dear to my heart, and that's wildlife trafficking. You know, we have this problem here in the Anthropocene, the current state of human domination of the planet. And so what I wanted to do was talk to you all about that today. So I'm going to start off by just reviewing some of the risks, the global risks in the age of human influence. You know, there are 4 kind of defining characteristics. The first is the likelihood and impact of global risks is increasing. The diversity, the scope, the scale of risks and human impacts is increasing. We are, you know, increasingly aware of all the costs associated with global risks and the associated system failures. And the other thing that we, you know, are living now here in this meeting right now, and then also because of COVID, is just connectivity. And so I don't mean to be speaking with so many superlatives, but risk really is a defining aspect of the Anthropocene. And so what I want to do is just show you some figures to illustrate this point. The World Economic Forum publishes this global risk perception survey every year. And, you know, what it does is it offers you know, attitudinal information about the likelihood and the perceived likelihood and the perceived impact of a variety of different risks. Technological risks, economic risks, geopolitical risks. And what I would like you to draw your attention to are these green diamonds. And the fact of the matter is that these environmental risks for the first time are perceived as being the highest likelihood and highest impact. And that is unprecedented. But let's look at it a different way. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services released a report in 2019 that talks about global extinction risk in different species and different groups. And so what we're seeing is that the more information, the more that the knowledge base is advanced about species and their survival, the more we see that the percentage of these populations are threatened. And some of these are grossly understudied. We tend to think a lot about the charismatic megafauna, the mammals, but we have ferns and relatives, dragonflies, birds, bony fishes, gastropods. It's really not that rosy a picture. Let's see, today is Wednesday. I think it was today is Wednesday. Earlier this week, I think it was either Monday or Tuesday, the UN Office on Disaster Risk Reduction released a report on the human impacts of disaster risks. And you can see this comparison of disaster event types, between 1980 and 1999, and then the past 20 years. And you can just see the total disaster events by type are, with the exception of kind of mass dry movement, we're increasing. And so, pretty much no matter where we are, some of you are in California, I'm in Maryland, we're all impacted by these risks, in differential ways. The Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime has estimated, the dollar value of select different types of transnational crime. And so what I wanted to do here was start to hone in on, illegal natural resource trade. So you can think about illegal logging, illegal fishing, illegal wildlife trade. Depending on whose, numbers you're looking at, you're essentially talking about anywhere between, 50 and 200 billion US dollars a year that is removed from the legal economy and is going to criminal bad actors. And of course, this is still less than drugs, but it's a substantial proportion of the global criminal economy. And that's one of the reasons why so many different sectors and disciplines are looking at this problem. And connectivity. This is a flow diagram from the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, and this is a flow of rhino horn. And so what you may think, oh, I read about rhino horn in the news, and I know it goes from mostly South Africa to Vietnam or South Africa to China. And what you can see here is that there are flows of animals from places like Malawi, Ethiopia, Angola, to countries like UAE, Singapore, Indonesia, China. There is so much connectivity that we really need to advance our, we need to advance the knowledge base. These natural resource crimes are hugely problematic. They're hugely complex, but the fact of the matter is that if we kind of knew how to figure this out, I think we would have done so already. We have a lot of smart people working on this issue, and they're motivated by all of the kind of diverse harms, risks, and threats that are associated with illegal wildlife trade or illegal logging or illegal mining, illegal fishing. There is violence, and the violence threatens animals and people. It undermines the rule of law. Just general criminality begets criminality. Taxpayers and investors and donors, we make investments in sustainable development, and environmental crime undermines these investments. The taxes that are removed from the legal supply chain are massive. There are cultural resources and cultural traditions that are degraded by wildlife trafficking and environmental crime. Certainly, wildlife trafficking relates to biological invasions of invasive species and spread of zoonotic diseases. It converges with other serious crime like drug trafficking, fuels corruption and other forms of criminality, and it synergizes with environmental injustice. So if I haven't depressed you yet, you know, sorry, I will be optimistic for, you know, I'll do my best. But, you know, this is pretty incredible, these harms, these threats. And so, you know, I think that we can start to, you know, so what can science do, right? So science can help build understanding about human environment relationships. Like what are the relationships where human that, you know, that we're talking about that are so central to these global risks? We have invasive species, endangered species, overabundant species. Another thing that science can do is really try to help understand who is involved in these relationships. Are we talking about, you know, communities that are on the ground? Are we talking about local individuals, global communities? How are the relationships maintained? We can, you know, dig into social psychology, human geography, criminology. Pretty much we can go, and where do we look for this? Pretty much anywhere there are people. And there are a few places that humans are not. So this really is a global phenomenon. And scientists, you know, I think that scientists have a huge role to play in supporting decision makers and enhancing the efficacy of governance and decision making, promoting resilience and optimization of resource allocation. And so I believe that science has a huge role to play. And I can tell you that from a lot of my science diplomacy interactions, there is an opportunity for science to really help advance understanding about human inner relationships. So my perspective is that solutions to some of these global risks that I've delineated here require at least the sciences of conservation biology, criminology and crime science, and risk and decision making. This is kind of the central thesis that guides all of my research. So we need to know about coupled human and natural systems. We need to know about ecosystem function and relationships. And we need to know about sustainable development and the human connection to conservation of biodiversity. But we also really need to understand the criminal dimensions. Not all human behavior is criminal. Some of it is. How do we control crime? How do we prevent crime? How do we promote compliance and deterrence, you know, to try to reduce these negative activities? And then there's also risk and decision making. I mean, how do we try to understand, how do we predict and promote certain types of human behavior? How do we support more effective governance and decision making? And then also we have so many groups of people. How do we understand experts and laypersons and their different perceptions and the merging of those perceptions or the conflict? So some of the questions that I ask in my research that are kind of germane to across problems are, you know, how do different communities think and act with regards to exploitation of natural resources, and what underlies the characteristics between and among groups of people? How can social scientific knowledge best be leveraged for public good? And then how can convergent or interdisciplinary science advance understanding in real life? So what I would like to offer is this idea called conservation criminology. And this is, you know, one approach to understanding, you know, global environmental risks. And the idea here is that you have some sort of rule violation or harm, and you need to start to understand the rule of law, the rules in use, you know, what's going on with the criminology dimension. And then we also need to understand risk and decision making, so we can assess, we can estimate, we can model. And there's definitely a criminal justice and a criminology dimension here, where we might think about policing or law enforcement or crime prevention, regulation. And then there's clearly a natural resource dimension. You need to understand the ecology and ecosystem function and differential vulnerability. So what conservation criminology offers is a way to synergize these different knowledge bases and try to promote, you know, interdisciplinary thinking about environmental risks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my conservation criminology research, but I wanted to kind of delineate the research operating environment, because I think that it certainly is important when you're interpreting the kind of validity and reliability of the data that are produced by scientists like myself. But I guess I'm hoping that the scientists and students that are and practitioners that are participating here today will find this operating environment like theoretically interesting. I don't think these are insurmountable problems, but this is kind of what's happening IRL. So stakeholders like victims and actors can be silent, and they have limited societal interfaces. So we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, right? Sometimes illegal behavior is covert, and a lot of the times we like to oversimplify criminals as being like stupid, but the fact of the matter is they can be incredibly intelligent and adapt in a very dynamic way to avoid detection. The data that we're dealing with is hugely fragmented. It's not comprehensive, and a lot of the time it's owned and siloed by actors that are reluctant to share data for a whole host of reasons. And then there's limited resources. There's a lack of available kind of resources at the end with which to combat some of these problems. So it's not the greatest research operating environment. It's not, you know, flush with a paved road, but this is what makes it interesting. So what I want to do is I want to provide 3 kind of examples, kind of what do we know and how do we know it with regards to conservation crime. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour because not many of us are traveling right now. I want to offer insights from some of my research in Madagascar, which is like illegal logging and wildlife trafficking focused, Democratic Republic of Congo and Republic of Congo, and then in Mexico. So I wanted to start off, before I get to these examples, I want to propose that there is a very oversimplified conceptual framework here to wildlife trafficking. And that is like 3-stage ecosystem. You have a source, a transit, and a destination location. And at the source, you have wildlife that is taken, it's produced in somehow, it goes to some sort of middle space, it's transited, it's transported, and then it ends up in its final destination. It's consumed in some way. So I would like to ask that you use this kind of 3-stage model to interpret some of the research that I'm going to talk about here. The other thing that I want to talk about is this idea of opportunity theories of crime. So this is the crime triangle. This is a very old, you know, almost 50-year-old theory from crime science. And it essentially says that crime is an opportunity. It's an opportunity that arises with the overlap in space and time of 3 ingredients. You need a lack of guardianship, a motivated offender, and a suitable target. And in that, when those 3 ingredients overlap in space and time, that's when the opportunity for crime is created. Therefore, if you're trying to prevent crime from occurring, you need to figure out one way to break one leg of the stool. Choose your own adventure. Which one do you want to take away? Which one are you interested in? That's where you can focus. So this idea of a crime triangle guides what kind of data I collect and the nature of the format of the data as well. I also want to acknowledge that we know that crime displaces. So we may say to ourselves, oh, we've done a great job of reducing crime. Have we? How are we measuring crime? We know that crime displaces in space and time in networks in at least 6 ways. It can displace temporally, right? And so we know that offenders might commit crimes at different times during the day. Offenders can adopt new modus operandi and displace in tactical ways. They can select different types of targets. They can move from one wildlife species to another, from one brand of car to another. They can choose to commit a new crime. They can go from drugs to wildlife. Space, right? They commit crimes in new locations, or there's perpetrator replacement, where you have the replacement of apprehended criminals by new ones. So this idea of the crime triangle and crime displacement are fundamental, again, to the way that I collect my data. So in Madagascar, I've had the good fortune to collaborate with a really amazing range of faculty and students and conservation organizations and civil society organizations on issues like illegal rosewood logging, lemur poaching, and then wildlife trafficking. And so you know, some of the data that I collect is really ground level. It's really participatory. And so what I'll do is I'll take a base map like this forested area, which you can get from, you know, land cover data. And I ask local people to share with me their lived experiences. Show me the meaningful places. Where is illegal logging happening? What are the flows? Who is participating? Are there guardians in certain places? Where are the valuable trees? And then with replication, you can start to build confidence in the data that's collected. And so this is a map of tree cover in eastern Madagascar. This is an example of a participatory risk map. And then with GIS, you can start to digitize some of this information. And what's really exciting about this information is that, you know, you can see how humans don't follow the rules. For any of you that teach, or for any of you that are students, we all know that students don't always like to follow the rules. And sometimes that's really good. So what are we looking at here? This is a digitized map of that, the plastic overlay. And so there's trees. The tree icons are where forestry officials identified there being these really valuable rosewood species. And then the triangles show different locations of police. And so in Madagascar, there are many different kinds of authorities. I think the slide is cut off a little bit on my computer screen, but what you can see is that sometimes colored triangles are overlapping the trees. So sometimes the police are close to the target, sometimes they're not. You can also see that there's a risk ranking. And so communities and individuals went through and they say, where is the risk of illegal logging highest and where is it lowest? And so one of the things that my eye is immediately drawn to are places where there's a police station and also a very low risk ranking. Yes, help yourself. You can try to use a spoon. Sorry, that's my daughter who wants cake. So that's a parenting win right there. I also see that there's a place where you have police where there's a really high risk. And so this is hugely problematic because you may have corrupt officials. The other thing that you can see is that individuals put really high risk illegal logging locations in the ocean. What they started to do, what the participants started to do is they started to map the supply routes, the illegal supply routes off island. And so it just goes to show you that, and so this information has now been actually validated by satellites and satellite imagery. And it's pretty interesting to see how local people have a really rich knowledge base about an issue when you don't even ask them. And so this idea of looking at local people as informants instead of only as kind of offenders is really useful. So then the maps get really pretty and we can start doing more, you know, spatial analysis. And at the end, we get this map, you know, on the right. And what this shows is a risk ranking of illegal logging. And so, you know, the red is high and the green is low. And so this is an opportunity to then direct resources, direct protective dimensions to try to protect illegal rosewood logging. Now, a lot of the times when you're dealing with certain types of crime, this idea of preventing it before it happens is really ideal. Once the tree is cut, it's cut. So yes, you can sanction somebody, you can arrest somebody, you can put them through the criminal justice system, but the tree is cut. It's not the same as if my cell phone is stolen. You know, I backed up my data, I backed up my contact list, I'm inconvenienced, and I have money, I can pay, I can replace it. Once an animal is dead, it's dead. And this applies to a lot of other serious issues like, you know, human trafficking or terrorism, right? We want to prevent these, you know, crime events from happening in the first place. We want to get left of boom. And so this idea of optimizing resources, optimizing decisions to prevent behavior is really important. So I want to then talk a little bit about the transit side of things. So how are illegal products moved? You know, the transportation, the consolidation, the distribution, the parcelization of products. And so here what I want to do is I want to move to, this is Republic of Congo. And so what we've done here is we've started to map the physical flows in the supply chain. And so what you can see, so this was for species like great apes, pangolins, and then also dwarf crocodiles. And so we tracked the bushmeat essentially from the source to the final destination. And so here we were really interested in this idea of transportation hubs and the consolidation of bushmeat at certain transportation hubs, parcelization, and then distribution. And what's really important here is this, essentially this spaghetti diagram on the left-hand side of the screen. You essentially have an infinite number of places where bushmeat can come from, and almost, you know, you have a smaller number, but essentially an infinite number of transportation hubs. And the flows between them, we know generally what direction it's going in, but how are you supposed to respond to that? And so this idea of preventing the bushmeat from being taken, preventing the transit in the first place, is something that's really important. And so having this kind of on the ground data enables more strategic, proactive, preventative policing or intelligence-based policing, very problem-based. So we've also done this, so, you know, this mapping trade flows using, you know, sociograms. And so at the bottom of the screen, you can see source, transit, destination. Again, you know, who are the stakeholders? How are they connected? Sometimes we know that they take different modes of transportation, you know, motorcycles, trucks, small boats, you know, river boats. How is information flowing? Is it face-to-face? Is it via the internet? And then the other thing that's really interesting is to start thinking about the consumption. And so we know that in places like Brazzaville, you have like upper, middle, and lower tier restaurants, right? So the upper tier is blue, the lower tier is red. And so you can start to look at different sociograms based on different social networks. You want me to cut that for you. So another thing that we're doing with regards to transit is we're looking at crime clusters. And so this is now the city of Kinshasa. This is in Democratic Republic of Congo. And what we did, again, using participatory risk mapping and then digitizing the information, is we started to look at the transit flows. How are wildlife species getting into the city, right? And so what you can see is that there's different routes, there's different markets, and the colors, the green, the blue, and the red are also those different restaurants. So you can also look at how crime clusters in certain spaces. So for example, Marché Gambela, the Grand Marché. So you can start to look at you know, areas of convergence, of spatial convergence. Crime is rarely homogenously distributed across a landscape. So again, having this kind of information really helps to offer some sort of intelligence that can then inform, you know, prevention. We've been starting to use this really very innovative, you know, prevention mechanism that actually was born out of homicide prevention interventions in the cities of Cincinnati and Las Vegas, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Las Vegas, Nevada. And that's this idea that, you know, to think about crime place networks and the places where criminals go when they're not offending, like comfort spaces, corruption points. Where do offenders get kind of brought into the fold? Where are the actual crime sites? And then where are the convergent points? So where is wildlife trafficking overlapping with other types of crime like drug trafficking? And so if you start to think about this previous map that I showed you, which is just looking at where the bushmeat is and where the bushmeat flows, it looks a little bit different than these single numbered circles on the map. And so what's really important is all of a sudden you start to realize that there are other places that are really important to be collecting data about and on that relate to your network. And so this just offers a more holistic perspective of the problem. So this is another way of thinking about this crime place network, right? So there's a crime site, a convergent setting, a corrupting spot, and a comfort space. And it's really interesting to think about like comfort spaces, because they can be churches, they can be schools, they can be sports arenas. And what's really exciting about identifying these different spaces is that it offers new opportunities for partnerships where individuals can potentially create new resource sharing agreements or leverage other kind of preventative influencers like a priest or a sports coach or something like that. It also helps really prioritize limited resources across the landscape. So we've been trying this idea also in Mexico with illegal fishing. And so again, we're looking at crime place networks. And so here, I'm sorry that the colors have changed, but you have blue circles to denote comfort spaces. Sorry, blue denotes comfort spaces. Yellow is corruption spots. Green is a convergent setting. And then red is a crime site. So usually we focus only on crime sites when we're talking about trying to prevent crime. And so what you can see is that there's lots of colors on this map. There's a lot of places that are relevant to the commission of crime process that we need to be thinking about. And then what was really interesting here is we started to be able to identify certain places, the really high risk, like marina or bodega or housing for non-locals. And we also looked at the inputs of labor and capital and where all these where these kind of resources flow. The other thing that's really complicated by illegal fishing is that you have crime place networks on land and crime place networks in water. And then in water, you have like near shore and far shore. And so it just creates just a huge issue of scale. But it's all relevant to the problem set. And so that's why I get really excited about collaborating with scholars like Dr. Delkina, because this idea of being able to harness big data and use machine learning tools to complement the good old brain, I think is really needed for a problem set like this. So this is illegal sea cucumber fishing and trafficking in Mexico, and I'm happy to provide more details about like what's a sea cucumber and who eats these things. So yeah, so this is just another example of place network investigations. So I want to now move to the final stage, this idea of a destination. And so we're trying to figure out like what's going on at the end, what's driving demand. And so in criminology, they do what's called a hot products analysis, or VIVA, right? You can determine, how hot a product is based on how valuable it is, how inert the product is, how visible and how accessible. And you can essentially assign rankings, VIVA rankings, to certain products. And that helps to predict what products are hot and then how products might displace. And so, you can think about, automobile theft. You can think about, why are all of the auto thieves in Washington, D.C. going after Toyotas right now instead of Hondas? Why are Toyotas hot and Hondas aren't? Because I think Honda's a more reliable vehicle. Well, you can look at the value, the inertia, the visibility, and accessibility. So we've applied this hot products analysis to bushmeat, pangolins, great apes, and dwarf crocodiles in Brazzaville, Republic of Congo, and Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. And what's really interesting here, what I want you to see is that there's a whole mishmash of hot products. And so it really varies. The questions that you ask influence the data that you get. And so what we've done here is we looked at two cities, right? Kinshasa and Brazzaville. And we also looked at different restaurant tiers. So upper tier, middle tier, lower tier. And we looked at, we elaborated a little bit on these VIVA categories, but we looked at like, what's the most requested? What's the easiest to cook? What's the easiest to find alive? What's the cheapest to buy alive? And what was really disconcerting actually from this analysis was how many times pangolins showed up on this this hot product analysis, because pangolins are currently, you know, considered to be, by some measures, the world's most trafficked mammal. And, you know, what's going on here? We also have species like monkeys, you know, which can be critically endangered and also transmit diseases to humans. And so, you know, and then why are gorillas easy to cook for low tier restaurants? Like, you know, you have these critically endangered animals. What is going on here? So there's entry points for decision making that emerges from a hot products analysis. And then there's also an opportunity to start to think about, you know, growth opportunities. So some people like snakes, and so, you know, is there snake farming that could be sustainable, or crocodile farming, you know, and the extent that which there can be more sustainable options developed could be one entry point for intervention. So what, essentially? Okay, so you go out, you collect all this information on the ground, and, you know, it's like case study based, and, you know, you have attitudinal data, and it's comprehensive. Like, so what? So how do you then advance the knowledge base and evidence in support of action? And so I wanted to share some selected examples with you about how I'm trying to support such efforts. And so the first example is, you know, the current National Science Foundation grant that Dr. Delkina, myself, and others have been working on with detecting and interdicting illicit wildlife trafficking supply chains. And so I think that this, I see a couple of cues. Dr. Delkina, is it okay if I take the questions now, or do you think I can? I'm going to take them now because I think it's good and I have time. Actually, I'm not, because these are good questions and they're big questions. So thank you, anonymous attendee and Lily. I will definitely answer these because you both are on point. So this project that we're working on right now is really illustrative of interdisciplinarity, and is incredibly challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. And so we have two kind of parallel research streams. We have this operations research stream and this computer science stream. And it's just because this was the like clip art in PowerPoint, but really they should be kind of streams that kind of are flowing together. But what we're really trying to answer here is we're trying to like better understand the structure and flow of these illicit networks and how they respond to different interdiction strategies. So how do wildlife trafficking supply chains react and respond to policy, to law enforcement, or to market interventions like, you know, consumption bans? What are the key decision points, behavioral patterns of participants, dynamic linkages between component parts, and convergence with legal supply chains? And then, you know, we're also asking, you know, how can different computational approaches help develop new and inform existing methods to detect meaningful patterns of weakness and resilience in these supply networks? The more we can target our limited resources, the better chance we're going to, I mean, it's an efficacy measure, it's an efficiency measure. And so if we can identify weak and resilient places in a network, that can help inform our modeling. We also are looking to better answer the question, you know, how can modeling simulation enabled by computational science advance understanding of the dynamics of illicit networks and inform crime prevention? And so one of the ways that we're thinking about this is kind of our guiding conceptual framework. And we're really trying to focus on this idea of network resilience. You know, there's supply chain resilience, there's network resilience. You know, you have, you know, you have communications companies, you have automobile companies, you have all sorts of companies that are really trying to understand how supply networks are resilient. We're trying to take that insight and apply it to illicit networks, because if we know where a network is resilient, we know where it's weak, right? Then we can like look at intentional types of interdictions, preventative actions or intervention actions. But really the connectivity between these ideas of resilience and interdiction, it's operationalized via computational science. And so these are really kind of, I think, exciting questions. And you know, our models will be able to be calibrated on the ground in Kinshasa and Brazzaville as we continue moving on. We're just wrapping up year 1 of 3 with this particular project. And what I think is really exciting about this project is we have data that has been collected about lots of different attributes of the supply network. So we can identify some of the crime sites, some of the convergence spaces, comfort spaces, and corruption spots. And then we also know a little bit about how information flows through these networks. We need to be looking at physical flows, informational flows, financial, relational coordination. And we also need to be thinking about, you know, where we're going to direct interventions, which are focused on network activity, and then prevention, which is focused on the whole operating environment. So this is a really, I think, exciting opportunity to think about this problem set, and we are kind of the first to be thinking about it that way. So that's kind of really exciting. And we're thinking about things from the perspective of interdiction. So there's, you know, 4 general categories of activity. You know, there's delay, divert, disrupt, or destroy. And so, you know, all of these actions have varying risks and considerations, including negative public reaction and ethical issues and stuff like that. But what we're trying to do is consider all of these different actions because all of them are kind of on the table right now. Another project that I have working on right now that was just funded is disrupting wildlife trafficking networks through convergence of physical and virtual ecosystems. And this is really interesting because I spent a lot of time talking about the physical crime ecosystem in the earlier part of my work. And this kind of like 3-stage ecosystem has dominated all of my research so far, right? This source, transit, destination. So I asked you to kind of sit with me as I proposed this 3-stage crime ecosystem. What's really interesting is that some of the virtual crime scientists and virtual network scholars and computational scholars are starting to talk about how the virtual crime ecosystem has 5 geographies. And how are we supposed to be combining networks, because we have these different ecosystems and wildlife is increasingly moving into these online crime virtual ecosystems. And so we're trying to use, you know, financial flows as a way to link these physical and virtual crime ecosystems. So this is an exciting, this is a planning grant. And so what we're trying to do here is build a community of scientists that are interested in trying to address these problems. So if this is interesting to you, please let me know, because it would be great to think about having you participate either in person or virtually, or in person if we're ever able to see each other in person again. It would be great to kind of have your insights. I think this is a really challenging question, and it's not just relevant for wildlife. This is relevant for human trafficking, drug trafficking, antiquities trafficking, etc. The other thing that I think is really interesting about, like, you know, this idea of virtual and physical crime ecosystems is just simply disaggregating our data in a very, very fundamental way. We have legal wildlife trade in the world, right? And we also have illegal trade. And so how do you disaggregate legal versus illegal? And so I don't know. Okay, so here's like a cute cartoon, Finding Dory, Finding Nemo. I don't know if you can raise your hand, but like, who thinks that like Nemo is the fish that is usually traded legally? Can you guys raise your hands? Is that possible? Someone raised their hand. I see this. Josh, I see you in the chat box. Do you think Nemo is legal or illegal? All right, I'm just going to tell you because I can't tell if anybody's there. So what's really interesting is that because of Finding Nemo and Finding Dory, demand for both of these species has boomed. But overwhelmingly, almost every single blue tang, every single dory that you ever see is illegally traded. Okay, they're almost always wild caught, and they're always almost caught with with really destructive fishing techniques. The clownfish, which is Nemo, they've like figured out a way to they figured out a way to cultivate these animals in fish tanks, but not the blue tanks. And so, you know, how are we supposed to disaggregate legal from illegal wildlife trade? Really, really challenging question. So as I move forward to concluding thoughts, I want to offer my observations. I'm a chronic optimist, as most of you who know me know, and so I have to say something positive. And so what I want to offer is that interdisciplinary and participatory approaches they have high transaction costs over the short term, but I believe that they're more sustainable over the long term. And that's one of the reasons why I lean in so much on these interdisciplinary approaches. I also think that there's a huge opportunity to engage local people as informants rather than offenders, and not criminalize individuals who are engaging in subsistence livelihood activities. I think that the tools and techniques that I've discussed here today are much more relevant for the high level, big cheese, bad actors, head of the snake, brilliant masterminds behind, you know, crime syndicates. Local people also can have and produce very accurate on the ground insights that we should be digesting as scientists. And we can also avoid normative judgments about natural resource use that, you know, are between the global north and the global south. It's also important for us to remember that what works in one location and context may not work in another, but the tools and theories can scale across contexts. We need to do a better job of scaling our scientific literature, our evaluation matrices, and so much more across the global north and south. And then finally, I think crime prevention can really complement many other types of interventions. And I'm not saying that we should be restricting ourselves in any way. I think crime prevention has offers a lot of opportunity. It's also challenging though, because if we're preventing crime, what is there to measure? So the counterfactual can be really hard to measure. So I'm going to stop there and direct you to my website and my Twitter handle, where I'd love to engage with you further. But for now, I think it'd be great if I can escape out of this and stop sharing my screen and we can have a chat. And this is where, so I have a chat box and a Q&A. So I guess.
I think most of the questions are in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just gonna start at the top. Is there data that shows the improvement and contribution after applying the idea of conservation criminology? That's an awesome question. One of the things that we're doing now is really working on trying to solidify some of these evaluation matrices and determine, you know, what happens kind of pre-post intervention. I have a project in Vietnam that we're implementing right now, and then also in Kinshasa, and then also in Mexico. So stay tuned. Hopefully, you know, we've written in these evaluation essentially protocols into the grants. What I will say is that we're replicating these crime science tools from traditional criminology, and they are wildly successful for things like automobile theft. They are successful for things like homicide, and some others. What's really interesting is that they're very, very localized. And what we're trying to do is take it to scale a little bit more. And so that will be interesting to see is, you know, how localized are these crime sites that we need to be thinking about. So I think that was a really good question. Thank you. Lily asked, how do you account for the different motivations behind conservation crime, comparing large-scale wildlife trafficking against subsistence poaching carried out by locals, keeping in mind that subsistence poachers may have very limited alternatives, economic alternatives? Yes, 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 yes. You know, we do in my lab a lot of research on what we call the cooking pot and pocketbook motivations to break rules. Poaching is not trafficking, right? Poaching is often, sometimes it's the nature of the animal that's poached, and that has to do with this idea of subsistence livelihoods. In my experience, I can't condone anybody's behavior, because at the end of the day, I'm just a scientist from the United States. Like who am I? My role is to be able to help local people, essentially provide a voice and help translate that information into decision making. And so my observation is that for a lot of the subsistence-based activities, I think that there's this idea that there shouldn't necessarily, it shouldn't necessarily be criminalized. It's the higher level trafficking where you have greater criminalization. Also, there's like some technical like rule of law dimensions here where, if somebody in South Africa poaches a rhino, there's really nothing that the United States can do about it compared to, it's different than what the United States does when the proceeds from that rhino horn that was illegally trafficked are filtered through a United States bank, commingled with proceeds from heroin trafficking, and then reinvested in real estate in Nairobi. And the Southern District of New York actually has a case which is exactly on that, except I think it's ivory and not rhino horn. So yeah, I mean, it's the large scale, the big cheeses, not the subsistence. And I think it's really important that we avoid criminalizing local people for so many reasons. And I'd love to talk more with you about that. But yes, Lily, that's a really important point. Another anonymous attendee said, for bushmeat is a large driver of demand culture. These endangered species are not eaten due to lack of other options, right? If so, how can better, more sustainable substitutes be advocated for, taking the cultural aspect practices into account? So actually, yes, it's definitely like gorillas and chimpanzees. That's cultural. It's like, what would happen in the United States if we were told that we couldn't have turkey on Thanksgiving? It's kind of like that. That's the analogy, right? To eat bushmeat is to have a taste of home. It's to connect with your family. It's comfort, if you're sick, if there's a wedding, if there's a baby, if there's a death, if you turn 13. And so, yes, there's this idea of, can you start cooking traditional dishes with fresh approaches? So there's like a couple of fusion chefs in Kinshasa and Brazzaville that have like cooking shows. And so they're trying to take like, instead of cooking elephant meat, can you try to do it with like chicken or something like that? So yes, this idea of sustainable alternatives that incorporate a cultural dimension. There's a huge campaign going on in Pointe Noire in Republic of Congo right now on this exact thing. And it's really focused on the food and the preparation of food, because it's super important for culture. So that's a really good question. Now I seem to be in the Q&A. I guess it doesn't matter. Given how significantly environmental crimes can contribute to the underground economy in certain areas, has there been an analysis done investigating how much lack of economic opportunities in particular regions can motivate criminal activities? Have there been pilot economic incentive programs that have attempted to mitigate such criminal activities? Awesome question. Environmental crime, like many other environmental crimes, is related to governance. And so, yes, this idea of, poor governance and corruption or lack of legitimacy of rules. So sometimes I might say that it is economic opportunity, but then it could also be like political economic, it could be dissatisfaction with government or governance at like a federal level or a state level. And so there are efforts to, incentivize good governance, good economies. Zakuma National Park in Chad is often touted as an example of this. I haven't been. I really am interested in seeing this for myself, so I share what I hear. But this idea that you had all this, you had a lot of poaching, you had some poor governance in this region around Zakuma National Park, and then the park became an epicenter for economic rehabilitation, not only for people that were employed by the park, but for the surrounding areas. So there was a new airstrip that was put in. There was a mechanic school so people could learn how to fix all sorts of automobiles, engines, right? Not just an automobile or a motor, but also an airplane, a truck, etc. And the idea being that better economy, better governance, co-management would result in decreased types of crime rates. And my understanding is that Zakuma has had really good kind of social responses from communities, but then also their wildlife numbers are going up. So that's an example of a win-win. That's like a one-off example. So I think we can do more there. That's a call for scientists to get on it. What are your thoughts on applying these techniques to reimagining policing in the wake of recent protests for racial equality? Yes, Kathleen Young, awesome question. I think what I see is that we have a lot to learn from each other. And I think that the conservation community and the criminology community can do a lot better listening and talking to each other. So in conservation, we're not perfect at all, but the conservation community does a lot of community entry. They do a lot of stakeholder engagement. They do a lot of co-management and co-sharing of resources. And I think that that's something that the policing and the criminological community can learn from the conservation community. This idea of equality in decision-making, engagement, participation. The criminology community doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. The conservation community has something going on there. Likewise, the conservation community doesn't really understand that much about, say, the penal system. And so criminologists often say, oh, we just need to be, we need to be arresting more people. Well, there's huge issues. There's huge social issues associated with putting people in jail, right? And so the criminology community knows a lot about this. And so that's something that the criminology community can teach the conservation community. And so, Kathleen, your question asks specifically about racial equality and policing. I will say that the conservation community is trying to do more of what's called community-based policing and intelligence-based policing, and then also kind of this idea of local guardianship as opposed to sort of a formal guardian, like a law enforcement official, like somebody who's more like a community watchwoman. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to learn from each other. This is an example of a high transaction cost. Dr. Delkina and I have been working together for a couple of years now. I have to be very humble and sometimes say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you please explain this to me? And she says the same thing to me sometimes, and so, we're both very intelligent scientists, but you need to feel comfortable asking questions about epistemology and ontology. And so you need to get people that are comfortable asking those types of questions. How do you get on the same page between highly diverse stakeholders with regards to the rule of law enforcement and guidelines? How is this taken into account in models? I think this is a really good question, anonymous attendee. The first thing that comes to mind is to think about GIS as a tool for integrating different knowledge sources. And so GIS can take like remote sensing data. It can take and I'm not a GIS expert, so please excuse me. But what we did with that Madagascar example is a good idea of like interdisciplinary intelligence mapping. So you can literally take satellite data of forest land cover and then combine it with local drawings on a piece of paper, right? And so essentially GIS can be the great equalizer. Now, the good GIS scientists in the audience are going to say, you can lie with maps, There's, you know, deviant spatial statistics, yes, right? But I do think there's an opportunity for scientists to come together with best practice. Like, these are problems that we can solve, right? I mean, we can come up with reliability estimates in our statistics models and things like that. So I do think that I tend to look at diverse stakeholders as producing diverse information and thinking about ways to merge all that information into as much of a comprehensive picture as possible. Sometimes that aggregation makes people feel a little bit more equal. Is there any effort to decrease the demand for wildlife? I think supplies will drop with the needs. Yeah. There's like there's like social marketing, there are commercial ivory bands. Yes, there's a huge effort to decrease demand. If I may be so humble, we have a huge human population on this planet. We have a rising middle class. We have globalization. Today is Amazon Prime Day. Who went shopping? You know, we're consuming. And so a lot of the times people just buy wildlife for all sorts of reasons. We're in a global pandemic. I have a headache. I know not right now, but like, you know, if I have a headache, you know, like my mom would be like, oh, you should eat soup. You know, really? No, I want to take a Tylenol, you know? So when you're not feeling well, you want to just kind of take everything. Somebody might say, oh, take this herbal plant. Oh, take this rhino horn, you know? And so I think that as we all are trying to self-actualize, we consume. And so this is like a meta question. I think it's really good. And I do think that the demand reduction activities are working. There's more to be done. I'm just looking at the time.
Yes. We have lots of interesting questions, but we are also out of time. So yes. I don't know how to finesse that. I don't know if you want to like just to try to quickly maybe with 2-3 sentences address the 2 outstanding questions, or maybe take them offline.
So I'll just say one. So I do see a question on gender and age and trends in environmental crime, and that's I'm like kind of midway through a project on women and wildlife trafficking, and there's really interesting. There's so much that's interesting out here on this issue, and so what I would say is that when you start collecting data that can be disaggregated by age, by gender. I'd also like to acknowledge that in many places, gender is still a binary male-female, and so we haven't even really gotten past that data collection point in many places. But I would say there are absolutely trends in environmental crime. We often can't see them because we're not even collecting data on this topic. I would like to acknowledge that, did anyone see in the news today or yesterday that NASA just created their first female toilet? How many years has NASA been, you know, up in space, and they just created their first female toilet? Now, why am I sharing this with you? Because we don't often think about gender disaggregated insight, okay? And if we don't gender disaggregate sometimes, or at least look at these issues from gender disaggregated places, or age disaggregated, or race disaggregated places, you just completely miss insight. You miss stakeholder groups to engage. You miss interventions. You miss resources. You're also not being just and equitable. So I think there's so much to be done here. And as scientists, we have a lot of work to do to disaggregate our data. So we also need to collect our data. And I do see that there's 2 more questions, and I'm really sorry that I can't answer them, but I will very much work to try to respond. My email is gorem@umd.edu, or folks at USC have my contact information. I see my friend and colleague Christian May asked a question. Hello, I don't know what time it is, but I'm so happy that you're here. So I'll try to answer them. And I really apologize that I didn't get a chance to answer them here. I'll just say, Dr. Delkina, thank you so much for having me. It was a real thrill. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, and I'll stop talking. Sorry.
Thank you, Meredith. It was a wonderful overview of this area, and I'm so happy to see such a big engagement from the audience. Like, clearly, this topic and your presentation of it generated a lot of interesting thoughts and comments. And so, yeah, I encourage everybody to please reach out to Professor Gore, and she's very collaborative, always looking for new perspectives and new collaborators and people who are just interested in this question. So go ahead and continue the conversation. And thank you so much again for coming to the CAIS seminar series. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.